Welcome. My name is Hope Curran Lundblad, and today I will be sharing about something very near and dear to my heart. Home, the art of hospitality. It's part of Nuos formation, and sharing about kind of the interweavings of what hospitality is to me, as well as my art practice and the implications for spiritual direction. So I'm going to start our time today by lighting a candle as a way to welcome presence and set a flame of light here with us today. I'll start our time with a poem. Feel free to close your eyes and listen to what might stir in you. Build. Gather bricks, rock, sand. We have a home to build in foreign land. The foundation dug deep, a hole hungry to be filled. Bring windows for us to see. Bring the door for guests to enter. Bring the roof to protect our heads, shelter when wind shakes. Bring working hands to hold tight to tools, our labor lasting, losing not the blueprint, a floor plan for family amongst the homeless. The cornerstone carved. Bring the chairs and table, it's time to feast. To celebrate the home we create daily as we bring raw materials and thankful hearts to build something far bigger than ourselves. What is home? This question continues to come back to me, and I want to focus on the hearth, the heart, the table, and what is welcome in hospitality. Today, I want to bring a space for us to gather in, even through technology. To start, I want to ask the question, what is home? Take a moment. What is the first thing that comes to mind? Is it a place? Is it a feeling? Is it a smell? Is it a person? Is it a longing? What is home? For me, home is many things. It's where my mother's chocolate chip cookies are. It's a place of shelter. It's France. It's California. It's people in whom I feel understood. For me, just a bit of context. I grew up in the suburbs of San Francisco to parents who are campus ministers who would constantly have our door open. People staying on couches, my mother baking cookies, letting college students do their laundry in our home. I grew up and then went to Santa Barbara for university, where I lived in a house called the Jesus Burgers House. And it was 7 women and 7 men that lived and shared everything we had. It was a bit like the Church of Acts. It was messy and beautiful. And then I moved to Paris, France, where I no longer had the ocean or family, and I felt alone for the first time that I can remember. And in that space, in that time, I found a rug on the streets of Paris, an old Iranian Kashan rug that was worth quite a bit of money, given to me by someone's cleaning up. I took it to a store and got it appraised and cleaned and brought it into my home. And this rug began a journey for me of researching what is home in the context of the public space and the private space. So these are photos from a few installations in spaces throughout the world: Paris, San Francisco. I even got married on this rug. So this is really the epicenter and desire for me to go deeper into what does it look like to incorporate spiritual direction practices into my art and embody more hospitality through space making. And so we begin with the table. The history of the table originates in ancient Egypt. It was for people's homes, but also for altars for the dead. In the pyramids, you would often find tables that were structured around a god or a being or a king, and it had offerings on them. The table was an altar. Western tables originated in medieval times with the long, narrow tables in dining places for monasteries. They were known as refectory tables. Imagine that. But in many cultures, in Asia and the Middle East especially, it is common to be on the floor, lounging. Then we come to communion and retreat. Many of you might know the work of Leonardo da Vinci or other paintings that you could find in the Louvre or the museums near your homes, even, of the Last Supper. It's a famous image. Jesus around the table sharing bread and wine with his disciples. Communion literally began as a meal. For me, I'm very interested in the French word copain. It means to share bread, co-pain, literally bread sharing. It also means friendship. It's a word you use for a boyfriend or a girlfriend. And it is also linked to the word accompaniment. Accompagnement is the word most French people use for spiritual direction. L'accompagnement spirituel. So let's go back to this idea of bread. Bread can be delicious, nourishing, and it's the simplest form of nourishment for most people in the world, the most accessible. Accompaniment literally means to share bread with others. And so hospitality, for me, is that simple root of sharing something that is nourishing and needed. The word hospitality in Greek is philoxenia, which literally translates to the love of strangers and the gracious and generous treatment of guests. The word host, which many of you might think about, oh, who's the host of this party? Who can I go to kind of ask questions? But it also is the word we use for the communion host in many Catholic and Orthodox traditions. The host refers both to human armies, a host of angels, and also heavenly bodies. And it's come to be used as in a technical sense with the divine name of God, the host. So when we think about hospitality, communion, the table, and retreat, for me, it comes back to bread and sharing something. The word retreat is also important in this research. Retreat literally means to retreat in a battle, go back to where is safe. It comes from the Latin word retratere, which means to draw back. And perhaps the table is our daily retreat, to draw back from the world, our lives, our work, and coming into communion, whether with others, with God, or with ourselves. There are a few biblical references in this research that I want to share with you. In Luke, it says, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives or rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and then you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. righteous. Luke 14:12-14. This idea of the banquet is quite stunning, and there's many banquets throughout the Bible, and this one is Jesus's banquet of inviting the poor. Who is around your table? And oftentimes when I throw a party, I think, who can I invite for my own social status? But in biblical hospitality, there's something quite different and needed about justice around our parties, our banquets, and our dinners. Perhaps this is an invitation to consider, who are we inviting around the table for the holidays? How does that person benefit us or not? Do we think about that when we host a party? The next verse is Romans 12:13-20. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. And if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, "It is mine to avenge, and I will repay." But on the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals upon his head. In Romans, we see another example of radical hospitality bringing justice and peace into the world. Imagine your enemy being shown a glass of water, a place to stay in your own home. It's quite vulnerable and in many ways challenging to consider who our enemy is and how hospitality could actually be the first step towards world peace in the nations. There's also the story of Jesus at the wedding in John. We all know, perhaps, that this is Jesus's first miracle. He's not just showing off, he is actually invited to this space of the miraculous through the most mundane means. Jesus and his mother and his disciples are at a wedding, and the guests are there enjoying, but the hosts are freaking out. They don't have enough wine. Jesus comes into the picture because his mother asks him to help. And in this, he turns literally what would be called bath water at the time, cisterns of dirty water, into the finest wine. As I live in France, I know wine is one of the most significant parts of communion, literally around the table. We never serve the best wine last. We start with the best wine to welcome people into the hospitality of the table. And this miracle is significant. It reminds me also of the loaves and fishes, where Jesus is not thinking of feeding the 5,000, but rather the worry of the disciples invites him into the miraculous. He takes a schoolboy's lunch, basically, of fish and bread. And in the breaking of the bread, in the tearing of it, which later leads to the Last Supper and the breaking of the bread becoming salvation, he feeds many hungry people, meeting their physical needs as well as their spiritual. Finally, there are two craftsmen in the Bible. These are the first people in the account of the Old Testament that are filled with the Holy Spirit. It is the creation of the temple. And when thinking about hospitality, it's easy to think about Martha Stewart or, the fancy hospitality magazines and recipes and the beauty of it all that is very surface level. But I want to make note here that God cares about beauty. As an artist, I find great comfort that the first people filled with the Spirit of God are craftsmen. It's Bezalel and his friend. Let me read that passage for us. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'See, I have chosen Bezalel, son of Uri, the son of Hur, and the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God, with wisdom and understanding, with all knowledge and with all kinds of skills, to make artistic designs for work in gold, silver, and bronze, to cut and set stones, to work in wood, and to engage in all kinds of crafts.'" This is encouraging because God gives the craftsman the gift, but it's also a craft. They learned these skills, and now it is being served in the kingdom of heaven to provide a dwelling place for God. So, how did we get to these temple builders? A bit of context biblically is the wilderness. God called his people out of Egypt, out of slavery, where they were laboring and in literal enslavement to the Egyptians, out into the wilderness, where God provided manna for them, daily bread. And the word manna literally means, what is it? And we think about God's provision sometimes. We don't quite know what it is. It's mysterious and it falls from the sky. Perhaps this too is a way of our own hospitality, is asking God for the provision we need. But tents are an interesting concept biblically and in our own lives. If you've ever been camping, you might have had the wonderful experience of waking up in the wilderness with trees and all of creation around you. And if you're like me, perhaps you have a few experiences of waking up cold and in the elements. Once I woke up with a puddle underneath me and thought, it must have rained. So tents are temporary structures. They are not meant to be lived in all the time. And in the wilderness season, the Israelites wandered in these tents. And the temple, which God asked to be built by these craftsmen, were a part of the invitation of God to have a dwelling place on earth. And so this temple, with all of its beauty and ornate treasures, was literally a community exercise. That poem I read at the beginning, it reminds me of that, of everyone was bringing what they had to build a physical dwelling place for God. To fast forward a bit, once the first church became, after Jesus died and resurrected, the apostles went and there was an underground church, literally. The Roman church was in the catacombs. If you've ever been to Rome, you can visit these still, and there is Christian graffiti in these spaces. It's quite beautiful. But it was literally subterranean. It was a church that had to be underground. It was the persecuted church, and many of them would worship in that space with the literal death around them of the fellow believers, where they would bury them. And then Constantine came and declared Christianity as the state religion, and the church moved above the ground. And there were then cathedrals and temples built on the same level of the other gods of the day. We see cathedrals as housing places for Christian art, religious beauty, stained glass, and even Notre Dame is reopening this week, which means a lot to a lot of people. Cathedrals are homes and sanctuaries, but they also sometimes stray from God's original intent to meet with Him. They can be places of distraction as well. But I find the beauty of a cathedral to welcome in the hospitality through beauty crafted by men and women. And then there's the idea of a chapel. And the chapels are literally a place of nonconformist worship and gatherings, a place of intimate community. And then there's the home. Home churches are also a place where you can literally build a metaphorical temple or chapel or cathedral, even in the place of your home. So we'll talk about what that means. I want you to think about and consider a beautiful church you've been in that had a piece of art or stained glass or an altar and the details of that. Then also consider the juxtaposition of that image with a tent. Anytime you've been maybe in a pop-up tent in the elements or the rain is coming through, and the vulnerability of that. Let's consider that in our own spiritual lives. Coming back to tents, we have a story in the Bible of the Trinity visiting Abraham. And this is a beautiful story of radical hospitality that releases the promises of God in Abraham and Sarah's lives, as well as the consideration of what does hospitality look like in the in-between spaces. So I will read for us from this passage of the visitors, the three visitors. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre. While he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day, Abraham looked up and saw three men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may wash all your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat, so you can be refreshed, and then go on your way, now that you have come to your servant." "Very well," they answered. "Do as you say." So then Abraham hurried over into the tent to Sarah. "Quick, get the finest flour and knead it and bake it into some bread." This icon here on this slide is by Andrei Rublev, and this is a beautiful icon that represents this story of the Trinity visiting Abraham. In spiritual direction, the Trinity is a common concept and reality for us to dance within. In this story of Genesis 18, the embodiment of the spiritual unity of peace, harmony, and mutual love are here. I love that Abraham jumps to his feet to show them hospitality and gets them simple things, some cheese curds and some bread. Now, later on in the story, Abraham is speaking with these guests and they ask him, "Where is your wife?" She's listening in from the tent over. And it turns out they ask her, they release the promise that Isaac is conceived. Sarah laughs, and laughter literally translates to Isaac in Hebrew. And in this kind of comical story, it's actually through Abraham and Sarah's hospitality to the Trinity that God releases the promise of their son and the promises of Abraham when he was a young man. And now he's old in the desert, waiting in a tent, and the Trinity comes to visit him. This is a significant story as we think about our own hospitality and how we can show presence and hospitality and our finest things to the Trinity in our lives. Perhaps it's through an unexpected visitor, someone showing up at our door. And there's a verse that says, "Show hospitality, for you do not know if you are showing hospitality to an angel in disguise." So consider what it might look like in our times together of showing each other the simple hospitality of what we have, a glass of water, a few meager crackers, and that this might actually release the promises of God in our lives. So some of the key concepts that come from this question of the art of hospitality come to mind for me. The word delight has been something I have been chewing on this year. In sharing with other people, I also want to receive the delight of sharing. And it might be found in details and small ways of providing a space that is beautiful and delightful to be in. I think of communion. My husband is a classic San Francisco man and started to bake his own sourdough bread even before the pandemic. He has his little starter in a jar that we travel with even internationally. And communion for him is to bake a loaf of bread that takes over 3 days from the start to the finish. The crumbs of his bread remind me of the people that get to come to our table. Communion can be quite simple. In France, bread is the center point of most things. You can access it easily, and it is something that can feed many. Communion goes beyond just the physical bread, too, copain, into also what it means to have a sacred moment with someone else and share communion with them, to have spiritual friendship and connection. The table is a stage for all of this. And literally, I'm sitting at a desk. A desk is a table, and it's a place where we study. It's a place where we do our work from, and oftentimes take Zoom calls and video calls for our spiritual direction. Perhaps it looks like setting the table during these times as well. The hearth, which I haven't spoken about much, but a hearth is a center point of a home and a place where fire is. It's a place of warmth. It's a place of comfort. A fun side note is the word for housewarming, when you have a housewarming party, comes from the root concept. In French, there's a word crémaillère, which is the hook that stands above a fireplace where you hook a pot. And the word for housewarming in French is this word for that hook. And it means to hook your pot is to start the soup, start the mixing of the ingredients of your life and warm the house with a fire and invite people in to eat. Isn't that a beautiful image of how the hearth, the warmth of our lives, can also provide sustenance for others? The hearth is also a place where you come for shelter and restoration and rest. I think it's not a coincidence that hearth and heart are almost the same word. Our hearts are the center points, the fireplace, the place in need of warming and fire and sustenance and tending. I also think about intentional conversation as a major concept for the table. It's easy to get distracted by hospitality being all the details of getting a meal on the table and the beauty and the Martha Stewart idea of what a home should look like. But really, it's centered around the depth of the conversation that's had. And this means asking questions. It means inviting people to share. It means cultivating a space of meaning around whatever hospitality is happening. The home is also a concept, and it continues to be a question for my generation, especially. What is home? A lot of my friends have moved around quite a bit. They've lived on and off with their parents and don't know where home will be long term. They're desiring roots as well as a spiritual community to call home. Perhaps the institutional church does not feel that way for them, and home can be a place of connection, meaning, and worship outside of just a building. Creating a hospitable space through spiritual direction. This is something I am trying to learn the craft of, whether it's through lighting a candle or being present to listening. There is a nuanced way to do this. Then retreat. I'm passionate about bringing people to a place of feeling rest and recovery and covering, and literally retreating the battlefield of life and into a place of warmth, nourishment, and sustenance. So, how does this relate to Christian spirituality? Hospitality is known throughout all generations and cultures. And you know when someone shows you hospitality, what that makes you feel versus when they're inhospitable. There's a verse that says, "They will know we are Christians by our love." So much of Christ's ministry revolves around the table. Think about who Christ ate with. Like that verse in Luke that says, "Who are you inviting to your banquet?" Christ practiced miraculous hospitality. He ate with sinners. This is relevant for our own work as Christians to let go of judgment, to be open to what God is bringing to us through community. The messiness of it, too. Imagine, what did Christ's table smell like? Did people bathe that came to his table? It's quite an imaginative process to think about what his table looked like and felt like. And the fun thing about Christ's ministry is that he often wasn't using his own home, space, or even food. There was miraculous that happened, bringing heaven to earth. Oftentimes he would invite himself over. We think of Zacchaeus and how Zacchaeus found salvation through being able to host the Lord in his home. The Pharisees did not like this. And so there's a radical invitation into our own Christian spirituality of hospitality, to be creative and to provide for others. Now, these photos on this slide are from a project I did called Home Is, as well as my mother's cookie recipe. My mother would make chocolate chip cookies and bring them just about everywhere. I was a kid who grew up on sugar, but this recipe was special. We think as kids that her oven was sacred and a place that no one else could make this same kind of cookie. So when I moved abroad, I started practicing making these cookies with French ingredients and sharing them with people. I called them ephemeral sculptures. They would disappear quite quickly, but provide a vessel of comfort and welcoming and kind of break apart the barrier of conversation. People could talk about what the cookie tastes like. They could talk about their memories of home or what recipes their family would make that were special. In the left-hand corner, this is a picture of an art gallery where someone is being welcomed. And there are third spaces as well that we can cultivate as Christians that are beyond the church and beyond just the secular world, but a melding, a liminal space. And the word liminal literally comes from the Greek word for the threshold. And the threshold was a place in the home that allowed for a doorway to be, but then also into the outside world. Threshold places are liminal spaces. And this is also something very important, I think, especially in our culture today, to create safety for others to enter in, be welcomed, and know the love of God beyond just the traditional structures. And so perhaps there are threshold spaces for us to enter into. These are the seats at the table we can prepare for Christ's table. And then finally, the heavenly feast we await for, of the Feast of the Lamb. I think about Revelation and this image of a feast and getting to dine with all the nations. And this is really what we're looking forward to and just practicing for here on earth. Our feasts, our meals, and our times together can be a foretaste of that heavenly feast to come. How does this all relate back to our spiritual direction practice? The practice of hospitality and the art of hospitality. Art is something that is nuanced. It is not a science. There's no answer that's right or wrong. This is a space to create safety, confidentiality, listening, and trust. This is hospitality. It's a space to be curious about the environment your directee might be in. How are you today? Where are you in the world? Is it comfortable? What's behind you? I notice a piece of artwork. Or asking them simply, what does home mean for you? What are you desiring in your home? Madeleine L'Engle has her phrase, the cosmos in the chaos. This is finding beauty in the messier things. I love this phrase, cosmos in the chaos, because perhaps even in our own messiness, there are miraculous things happening. Even in the lack, there is a miracle happening with the loaves and fishes of our lives. And this is really an exciting thing, to invite God into the chaos of our lives and see where the cosmos, the universe, the bigger things are. This is also an invitation into pilgrimage. Pilgrimage is leaving the place you know and journeying out into the unknown, trusting that God will provide. It's inviting others to journey towards home together. It's a creating of sacred space in our homes that also invites the presence of God. Through prayer, we can make our homes more hospitable, just simply through prayer and blessing it and blessing other people's homes as we go. Here are some hospitable invitations to consider in your times with others in spiritual direction. Like I did at the beginning of our time, and it's still lit and burning, I lit a candle. This is something my spiritual director has taught me, and it creates a moment of flame, of light, of sacredness. And even on Zoom, it allows us to have a connection that might not be physically present in the same room, but we have an element that is the same, which is fire. This has created a sense of peace for me, and after the time is done, the candle is still lit, and it is a space of containment to have something to begin, a ritual as well, and it's a hospitality to the spirit. Another invitation is to consider a nature visio divina. Visio divina is like lectio divina, and it is inviting God to speak through things that are seen. So today I brought out my little garden bouquet. If you can see it, it has some pine leaves, rosemary, and some dying geranium for Christmas time. And for me, this is a way I can delight, even from the indoors, of something that is outdoors. I love flower arrangements and being outside, and it's really nice to have a garden. Not everyone does. But another practice could be to invite your directee before the meeting to take some time outside, wherever that might be, in an urban setting even, and looking around, and whether it's taking a photo of the thing or actually collecting something small. Even it could be a stone that sticks out to them that's beautiful and has a pattern on it. This is something you could bring as material during your time to consider. And like Lectio Divina, take time of silence with the object, just noticing, and then take time to meditate on what God might be inviting through this object and exploring the physicality of it. A flower, stone, leaf, or something that resonates from the Creator, and we can get curious about it together. I hope these hospitable invitations inspire you in your own spiritual practices and rituals that can invite the creativity of God. Another meditation and reflective project that I would like to practice for myself this week is just setting the table. I want you to take a moment and just think about a beautiful meal you've had. Maybe it's a picnic or at a restaurant, or being shown hospitality. And this is an invitation to find time and space alone for a solo meal, which is kind of sacred for many, but also could be something that could be seen as quite lonely. This is a practice of setting the table in a special way for yourself and Christ. Light a candle, create a small floral arrangement, or use a special linen, or simply cook something special you wouldn't normally make, or a recipe that reminds you of home. Take time in silence before beginning to eat, to delight in the things around you. And while you eat, welcome Christ to be there with you. Show hospitality to you. And you can also show hospitality to him. It's kind of like a date night with Jesus, as cheesy as that sounds, but setting the table for yourself is a practice to be able to set the table for others, to first receive and drink and take communion. This could also be an adventurous picnic. Take a small sandwich or get something to go and take it to a beautiful place where you can commune with your Creator. I want to acknowledge some of the limitations, controversies, and cautions around the culture of hospitality and some of our assumptions we might have. First of all, we live in a consumeristic society, and globalization is more and more making hospitality homogenous and capitalized. We think of Starbucks and the joy of, getting what you want right away, but authentic biblical hospitality is not a Martha Stewart ad. As great as Martha Stewart is, nothing has to be perfect. And I think the allure of consumerism creates comparison and limitation rather than abundance. And so biblical hospitality goes beyond the visual side of things as well as dives into the possibility of abundance through simplicity. The story of Martha and Mary comes to mind as well. A lot of times I've heard women, especially in ministry contexts, say, "Oh, I'm such a Martha." But really, that is limiting themselves to the invitation to become like Mary, as well in the story of Luke 10, which Jesus is invited to Martha and Mary's home. It's both of their homes. And Jesus tells Martha, "Wow, you seem really worried and anxious. Look at what Martha has chosen. She has chosen the good portion." I think we need to be careful about how we look at hospitality and how it can become a comparison of who is not doing something or who is. There's so much more than just becoming a Martha or a Mary. Jesus loves them both. They're both in the kingdom of heaven, but Martha is told that Mary chooses the better portion of being present. We have to name what's in the room of gender roles. The 1950s housewife was idolized to be the woman of hospitality, Barbie, and these gender roles that oftentimes women slip into that might not be their higher calling or gift. And so, knowing even in my own marriage, my husband is the chef, and we are collaborating, and there is not like a specific gender role, but rather we get to act out of the beauty of the sexuality God's given us and the creativity in that. The hospitality doesn't just stay within a wife or a woman or a home, but it is applicable to all people, all genders, all nations, and all ages. Also, the reverse hospitality that Jesus practices. I think sometimes we can get caught up in what we don't have rather than how Christ practiced hospitality. He used other people's homes, other people's food, bath water, and other things to produce the miracle of presence. So I think there's a lot of invitations for us today to consider how we think of hospitality in a disordered way and reordering ourselves to the posture of presence and welcoming people into our homes, lives, and hearts. I'm so thankful that we've gone on this journey together, and I want to end our time like we began it, with a poem. So close your eyes or take a moment of pause in your day and let the abundance of God's presence fill your heart with hospitality. Open your hands wide. Look up to the sky. There are tiny miracles that reveal themselves as we give thanks. Take time and breathe. Notice the space in your lungs, oxygen flowing. This is abundance. As we gather, may our tables be testimonies of this vast miracle of life. Taste the flavors of fullness. Feast on the present moment, here, today, in the abundance of hands open wide. Thank you for listening, and thank you for Nuos Formation and all of the people in our little hospitable digital community for making this presentation and experience of life together all the more rich.